Have you left your gardening tools outside? Are they looking a little rusty? Do they need a little bit of work? Well, today we're here with a few garden tools that are in a little bit of a state of disrepair, and we're going to see what we can do to them to get them back cutting nicely and working well. We have one of our neighbours' secateurs that have worked really hard and need a bit of a touch-up. We have a pair of snips that have gone through a little bit of wire that need a fair bit of work, actually. And again, my own mini secateurs that I have stalwartly refused to clean and dry off after use, which have now built up a lot of gunk and a bit of rust. So we are going to get these 4 tools back working nicely with just a few basic methods and techniques. So when we're working on gardening tools, it's important to keep in mind the anatomy of the tool we're working on. So a pair of secateurs or snips or head shears are all 2-bladed tools. Secateurs themselves have a blade and an anvil. The blade is what we'll be working on most, but it's important to bear in mind that the blade and the anvil intersect on the flat backs of each surface. So the blade has a flat, the anvil has a flat, and we want to do as little amount of work as possible on each of those flats because we want to maintain them crisp and flat. If we start to wear away by sharpening on the flattened side, we then lose nice contact between the blade as it slides over the anvil and we get a looser cut, and in the worst case scenario it can stop cutting. On the snips and on the head shears we have 2 blades rather than a blade and an anvil, and so what we want to do is we want to make sure that we're sharpening the bevel side and just touching up the flat side to deburr. We don't want to work the flat side very hard, again because we want these as they slide over each other to maintain a nice crisp contact. And you can also diagnose a few things here by opening and closing your tools. So I'm not sure if we can hear this through the microphone, but these get a little crunchy towards the end of the cut. So it might be that we have some small chips or burrs right on the end of the blade. And finally, the budding snips follow a similar pattern where we want to preserve the flats of the blades and work on the bevels, but these particular ones have a nice couple of half-mil dents and nicks out of the ends of the blades, which is going to take a lot of work to get out, and I'm interested to see how far we can get through them. But again, you can feel, as you close the blade, you can feel those dents as they slide over each other, stop it closing nicely. You can also hear it. So the 2 tools we're going to start off with are the most degraded. So this is the budding snips, which although they haven't been heavily used, they have this snip out of the tip and they have a lot of rust on them. We're going to deal with the rust first before we start working on the edges. And this pair of Okazuni secateurs has seen a lot of use. And so even though they've got some light rusting around the bolt, most of their surface is actually black. And that leads me to think that's actually built up gum and sap off trees and plants. So we're going to work on removing that in a different way to the rust. So let's begin with the rust. This is Renaissance Decorroder. Renaissance also makes a wax, which we use and we love very much for tool protection, but Renaissance Decorroder is really good at removing rust, and it's fairly gentle to use. It's quite benign. If you'd like, you can use something like a cotton bud or a small brush to apply it. I often just use my fingers because I haven't had any ill effects come of that. But what we're going to do is we're going to cover the tool because its handles are rusted as well as the blade. We're going to cover the tool, handles and all, with some Decorroder. I'm going to leave it for about 10 minutes, come back, wipe it off and see what it's done. So we've got a light layer of Decorroder all over the snips. We're going to set them to the side and we're going to work on the secateurs. So the secateurs, because they're covered in what I would consider a sort of more organic gunk, we're going to try and dissolve that crud. For this, I really like the Yanapika Saw Cleaner by Gyokucho. And this does a really good job of dissolving organic matter. It's best done immediately after you've used your tools. So if you use your tools in a good hard pruning session and then use this to take your organic matter and sap off your blades and wipe them down clean, they will stay in very good nick for a very long time. Prevention is far better than a cure in this case. This is a nylon brush. I wouldn't use a metal brush on any of these, but a nylon brush would be quite handy to give them a scratch up on the surface to remove any sort of caked on gunk. You can also use a toothbrush if you don't have one of these around the house. Probably not the one you're currently using though. So while we are using the chemicals, on the other three pairs of secateurs, let's talk briefly about sharpening. And it's probably easiest to talk about sharpening on the head shears because they're bigger. So we at JTA currently offer 3 grits of garden-focused Waterstone. We call these the Radius Waterstones. There is a coarse green, I think it's a 320 grit, a medium 500 grit in the white, and a finer 1000 grit in the red. These sorts of grits for gardening tools don't need to be as fine as the grits you'd use for woodworking tools or for kitchen knives. And they also don't need to be radiused when you're talking about secateurs and head shears. The radius comes in really handy if you're sharpening sickles and other curved gardening tools, but for these ones we'll probably be using the flat sides anyway. So after the first round of degunking with the decorroder, the small secateurs look ready to work on, but the larger pair still have quite a lot of gunk left on them. So I'm going to just wipe off the first layer and reapply a nice thick coat of decorroder. I'm going to set them to the side, and while that's working its magic, I can get started sharpening the smaller pair. I'm going to start out with a 500 grit Waterstone. For gardening tools with curved edges, you have a very small contact patch between the stone and the steel, which means that your work is quite concentrated. So I think 500 grit is plenty to start with on secateurs. Going coarser might give us some fairly deep scratches. I'm going to work it fairly regularly. Nice consistent strokes, keeping the angle fairly consistent. And when I feel that I've worked up a small burr on the back of the blade, I can move on to the 1000 grit Waterstone. Once I've done the bevel, I'm just going to make sure that the anvil's clear of gunk. I'm not going to do a huge amount of work there. And to finish off, I'm going to rough up the surface of the 1000 grit Waterstone and get that slurry onto a piece of scrap timber. That scrap timber with the 1000 grit slurry is now my strop. It's a bit harder than a leather strop, which means I need to be as consistent with my angle as I was with the stone, but that slurry will break down, and as you can see, it'll give us a really nice finish and just polish our edge. Really easy to keep one of these strops in the shed with the secateurs to touch it up regularly, and I'm also going to make sure that I can deburr it nicely on the back. And we're done. The budding snips aren't going to be quite as fast or as simple on account of these massive chunks out of the edge. I'm going all the way down to a 280 grit Waterstone. That's the coarsest Waterstone I have in these sorts of sizes. And I'm going to make sure that I raise a burr on the back of the blade. I'm going to be working the steel as hard as I can with the 320 grit. What that means is that there's no point moving on into a finer grit unless I've done all the work that I can on the 320. If I can't get the chips out on a coarse stone, there's no point trying to get them out on a coarse stone. I'm just going to push the burrs back as I work with the timber strop, and then work them again with a coarse stone, trying to make sure that the burrs stay even on each blade. With a coarse stone, it's really important to get the geometry as close as you can to correct, because when we move on to the finer stones, we're going to have less scope to correct our geometry. Following the angle of the bevels, I'm going to work that 280 grit until I get back through those chips, and once I'm through those chips, I'm going to refine the scratches with the 500 grit stone. This is the stone that I started with on the pair of secateurs that didn't have the chips out of it. Giving them a test, they're getting closer, but where those chips started, I can still feel that I can't quite close the snips nicely. I'm going to work those flats with a 1000 grit stone to make sure that I've removed any sort of dented steel that's getting in the way of them closing nicely. And then I'm going to start working the bevels with the 1000 grit stone. So I've worked through the 280, the 500, now the 1000 grit. My strop with a 1000 grit slurry on it is going to come back into play once I'm done there and start to polish up my edges and polish up my bevels, as well as deburring the back of the blades. The Okatsunis needed so much work that we're going to put them in their own video, which will be linked either above or below this one. That finish needed a lot of work, as did the chips, so we started right down at the coarsest stone, working up through the 500 and then the 1000, deburring as I went to get the chips out and make sure that we had good closure across the two flats, and then trying to polish the bevels. After all of that, it's time to give them a test snip and then take them across to the park and see how many different varieties of weeds we can trim. They do really well on the small stuff, the snips are happy, the little secateurs feel really nice, and the bigger secateurs are doing really well with even the woody stuff. So after 20 minutes of snipping in the park, we've got a little bit of a feel of how our edges are performing. The snips and the little secateurs are an absolute charm. They've done really nicely, and I think just as good as when they were new, and I'll be very happy to take those home and keep using them in my flowers and herbs and things like that. they can go back to their rightful owners. These secateurs, before I give them back to their owner, I'm going to polish that bevel, probably with a leather strop, not aiming for the edge, just aiming for the surface finish. Because what I noticed was that as I was cutting, about halfway through the cut, they'd slow down. And I think having a nice polished finish on that bevel will allow them to keep cutting nice and smoothly. Other than that, they were nice and sharp, and they've got a lot of power in them. So they're very, very nice to use again. So I hope that was helpful. Hope that you are able to keep your secateurs and snips and head shears performing in the level you'd like and the level they started at. If you have any questions about sharpening garden tools, let us know. Give us an email, info@japanesetools.com.au, or a phone call. All right. Happy gardening.